In the sprawling hills of Malibu, where million-dollar mansions perch like crowns above the Pacific Ocean, secrets have a way of echoing through marble hallways long after their owners think they've been buried. The Whitmore estate, with its towering columns and pristine gardens, appeared to be just another monument to American success. But behind its gleaming facade, a young man named Maxx Fisher was about to discover that some conversations never truly end, and that the most profound connections often come from the most unexpected places. What started as a desperate search for employment would become a journey that would challenge everything Max thought he knew about family, loss, and the courage it takes to truly listen to someone's pain. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the unemployment office in downtown Los Angeles as Maxx Fisher sat in a plastic chair that had seen better decades. At 28, he possessed the kind of quiet intelligence that often went unnoticed in job interviews, the type that revealed itself through careful observation rather than flashy presentations. His dark hair was neatly combed, his thrift store shirt pressed to perfection, and his worn leather shoes polished until they almost looked new again. "Next," called the clerk, and Max approached the counter with a folder containing his increasingly thin collection of rejection letters. "I'm looking for any available positions," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "Preferably something with room for growth." The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Dorothy, whose nameplate had lost its Y, barely looked up from her computer screen. "Experience in hospitality?" "I worked at the Grand Pacific Hotel for 3 years before they downsized," Max replied. "Concierge services, guest relations, event coordination." Dorothy's fingers clicked across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "There's a domestic position available. High-end residence in Malibu. They're looking for someone with hospitality background." She paused, finally looking at him over her reading glasses. "Fair warning, they've gone through 4 people in 6 months. Families particular about their standards." Max's heart jumped. After 8 months of unsuccessful interviews and dwindling savings, he couldn't afford to be picky. "What kind of domestic work?" "General household management. Cleaning, organizing, some personal assistant duties. The pay is excellent, suspiciously excellent, if you ask me, but they require someone who can start immediately and maintain absolute discretion." The word discretion carried weight in Los Angeles, especially when it came to wealthy families. Max had learned during his hotel years that the rich often had complications that required careful handling. "I can handle discretion." Dorothy printed out an address and contact information. "Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. Call this afternoon. If she likes you, you could start tomorrow." She slid the paper across the counter. "And Fisher? Whatever you see or hear in that house, you didn't see or hear it. These people don't just fire employees who talk. They make sure they never work in this town again." 2 hours later, Max stood before the gates of the Whitmore estate, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke with Mrs. Whitmore's assistant. The property stretched for what seemed like miles, with manicured lawns that looked like green velvet and a circular driveway that could accommodate a small wedding. The main house rose before him like something from a magazine, white stone, tall windows, and architectural details that spoke of old money and older secrets. "Mr. Fisher?" The voice on the phone was crisp, professional. "Mrs. Whitmore will see you now. Please proceed to the main entrance." The front door opened before he could knock, revealing a woman in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled into a perfect chignon, and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. She wore a navy blue suit that probably cost more than Max's rent, and her handshake was firm enough to communicate authority without seeming aggressive. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "You come highly recommended, Mr. Fisher." The interior of the house was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across cream-colored walls, and original paintings lined the hallways like a private museum. Everything gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that suggested an army of staff. Yet Mrs. Whitmore had mentioned she needed help with household management. Your previous employer spoke very highly of your discretion and attention to detail, Mrs. Whitmore continued, leading him through a living room that could have housed a small family. Those are the two qualities I value most in my staff. I understand the importance of maintaining privacy, Max replied, noting how she'd emphasized the word discretion just as Dorothy had. May I ask about the specific duties you'd need me to handle? Mrs. Whitmore paused beside a marble fireplace, her expression growing more serious. My son has been struggling since his mother passed away 2 years ago. He's brilliant, graduated summa cum laude from Stanford, built a successful tech company before he was 25, but grief has a way of derailing even the strongest minds. She gestured toward a portrait hanging above the fireplace, and Max's breath caught. The painting showed a woman in her late 30s with warm brown eyes and a smile that seemed to hold secrets. She wore an emerald green dress that complemented her auburn hair, and there was something about her expression that suggested both kindness and strength. That's Victoria Whitmore, my daughter-in-law, Mrs. Whitmore explained. She died in a car accident on the Pacific Coast Highway during a storm. My son, Blake. He hasn't been the same since. Max studied the portrait, noting the quality of the brushwork and the way the artist had captured something ineffable about the woman's spirit. I'm sorry for your loss. Blake lives in the east wing of the house, Mrs. Whitmore continued. He's become increasingly isolated, spending most of his time in his study or wandering the grounds at odd hours. The previous staff members found his behavior unsettling. They complained about hearing him talking to himself, about his irregular schedule, about his requests for meals to be left outside his door rather than served properly. The picture Mrs. Whitmore was painting suggested someone wrestling with profound grief, and Max felt a flicker of recognition. He'd seen similar behavior in hotel guests dealing with loss, the way trauma could make people retreat from normal social interactions. What exactly would you need me to do? He asked. General household maintenance, but more importantly, I need someone who can interact with Blake without judgment. Someone who won't gossip with the neighbors or sell stories to tabloids about the eccentric millionaire's son. Her voice carried a note of protective fierceness. Blake is not crazy, Mr. Fisher. He's in pain. There's a difference. Mrs. Whitmore led him through several more rooms, explaining the household routines and expectations. The East Wing, she mentioned, was Blake's private domain, but occasionally he would need meals delivered or assistance with various tasks. The key was to be helpful without being intrusive, professional without being cold. The previous employees lasted an average of 6 weeks, she admitted as they completed the tour. Not because the work was difficult, but because they couldn't handle Blake's unique needs. He requires staff who can think beyond conventional approaches. As they returned to the main foyer, Max noticed several framed photographs on a side table, images of Blake and Victoria together. In the photos, Blake appeared confident and happy, his arm around a woman whose laugh seemed to fill the frame even in still pictures. The contrast between those images and Mrs. Whitmore's description of his current state painted a picture of someone lost in the gap between who he used to be and who he'd become. When would you need me to start? Max asked. Tomorrow morning, if you're willing. The pay is $1,500 per week, plus full benefits and room and board if you choose to live on the property. Mrs. Whitmore's offer was generous enough to make Max wonder what she wasn't telling him. I should mention that Blake sometimes keeps unusual hours. You might hear movement in the house late at night or early in the morning. This is normal for him. Max nodded, already mentally preparing for the challenges ahead. Working with someone processing grief required patience and adaptability, skills he'd developed during his hotel years when dealing with guests facing various personal crises. There's one more thing, Mrs. Whitmore said as she walked him to the door. Blake has a tendency to talk through his thoughts aloud. If you overhear these conversations, please don't feel compelled to respond unless he directly addresses you. He's working through complex emotions, and interruption can be disruptive to his process. As Max drove away from the estate, the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly to his right, he reflected on the unusual opportunity ahead of him. The Whitmore family clearly had resources, but they also had pain that money couldn't heal. Blake's isolation and his mother's protective concern suggested a household walking carefully around a wound that hadn't properly healed. The next morning would mark the beginning of what Max assumed would be a straightforward domestic position. He had no way of knowing that within days he would become witness to conversations that would challenge everything he thought he understood about communication, healing, and the different ways people find hope in the darkest moments of their lives. The Whitmore estate held secrets that went far deeper than grief, and Maxx Fisher was about to become the unlikely catalyst for revelations that would change everyone involved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Max's first day at the Whitmore estate began at 6 in the morning, with a list of tasks that seemed almost too normal for a household harboring such obvious secrets. Polish the silverware in the dining room. Organize the library's periodicals. Water the orchids in the conservatory. Simple, methodical work that allowed him to familiarize himself with the rhythms of the house while staying out of Blake's way. The East Wing remained conspicuously quiet throughout the morning, though Max noticed that a breakfast tray left outside the main suite had disappeared by 9 o'clock. Mrs. Whitmore had departed for a charity board meeting, leaving specific instructions that Blake was not to be disturbed unless he specifically requested assistance. He usually emerges around noon, she'd explained before leaving. Sometimes he'll want lunch in the garden, sometimes in his study. Just follow his lead and don't take anything personally if he seems distant. By 11:30, Max had completed most of his assigned tasks and found himself in the main hallway, polishing a collection of crystal vases that caught the morning light streaming through tall windows. The house felt enormous around him, filled with the kind of silence that suggested wealth but also isolation. That's when he heard it, a voice coming from somewhere deeper in the house, speaking in low conversational tones. At first, he assumed Blake was on a phone call. But as Max moved closer to complete his work near the East Wing entrance, he realized there were no pauses for responses, no phone conversation cadence. "I keep thinking about what you said about the garden," the voice continued, warm and thoughtful. "You were right about the roses. They needed more attention than I was giving them. I hired someone to take care of them properly. But I know that's not really the point you were making." Max paused in his polishing, trying to respect Mrs. Whitmore's instructions about not interrupting, while also ensuring he wasn't eavesdropping inappropriately. The voice was definitely Blake's, but he seemed to be having a complete conversation with someone who never responded. "The quarterly reports came in yesterday," Blake continued. "Revenue's up 18%, which you'd probably say means I should be expanding the scholarship program. You always thought success meant nothing if it didn't help other people succeed too." There was a long pause, and Max resumed his work, assuming the conversation had ended. But then Blake's voice returned, softer now, with a note of vulnerability that made Max's chest tighten with recognition. "I know you'd be disappointed in how I've been handling things. Not the business, that practically runs itself now, but everything else. Mom tries to hide it, but I can see how worried she is. She keeps bringing up therapy again, keeps suggesting I get back out there, whatever that means." Another pause, longer this time, and Max realized he was holding his breath. There was something about Blake's tone, not the rambling of someone talking to himself, but the careful, attentive quality of someone engaged in actual dialogue. "The hardest part is that everyone expects me to move on. As if 2 years should be enough time to figure out how to exist without you. They don't understand that moving on would mean forgetting how you laughed at bad movies, or the way you reorganized my entire filing system without asking, or how you could make me see solutions I'd been missing for months just by asking the right questions. Max found himself drawn toward the source of the voice despite his better judgment. Something about Blake's words resonated with a grief he recognized, not just sadness, but the particular anguish of losing someone who had been integral to every aspect of daily life. Following the sound, he discovered that Blake was in the main living room, positioned directly in front of Victoria's portrait above the fireplace. Blake himself was nothing like what Max had expected. Rather than the disheveled recluse Mrs. Whitmore's description had suggested, he was impeccably dressed in dark jeans and a crisp white shirt, his dark hair neatly styled, his posture attentive and engaged. He was talking to the portrait as if Victoria were sitting right there with him. "I've been thinking about your suggestion for the community center," Blake continued, his eyes fixed on the painted figure above the mantel. "The one you mentioned right before the accident. You said we should fund a technology program for kids who couldn't afford computers at home." Blake's expression was completely focused, as if he were listening to responses that only he could hear. There was nothing manic or disconnected about his demeanor. He appeared to be having the kind of intimate, meaningful conversation that people have with their closest confidants. "You're right," he said after a moment, nodding slightly. "I have been using work as an excuse to avoid dealing with people. But it's not that simple, Vic. When I'm around other people, I have to pretend to be okay. I have to act like I'm healing or processing or whatever term makes them comfortable. With you, I can just be myself." Max realized he was witnessing something profoundly private, yet he found himself unable to move away. There was something about Blake's conversation that didn't feel like denial or delusion. It felt like a genuine attempt to maintain connection with someone he'd lost. The new employees. "Mom keeps hiring don't last because they think I'm talking to myself," Blake continued with a slight smile. "They don't realize I'm talking to you. There's a difference, isn't there?" At that moment, Blake's gaze shifted slightly, and he noticed Max standing in the doorway. For a brief second, both men froze, Blake clearly embarrassed at being discovered, Max uncertain whether he should apologize and retreat or acknowledge what he'd witnessed. But instead of the awkward confrontation Max expected, something else happened. Blake's expression shifted from embarrassment to curiosity, as if he were seeing Max clearly for the first time. "You're the new guy," Blake said, his voice carrying neither hostility nor defensiveness. "Max, right?" "Maxx Fisher," he replied, setting down his cleaning supplies. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just finishing the crystal collection and you heard me talking to my dead wife," Blake finished matter-of-factly. "Most people find that disturbing." There was a challenge in Blake's tone, but also a kind of test, as if he were waiting to see how Max would react to his honesty. In that moment, Max made a decision that would change both their lives. "It doesn't sound disturbing," Max said carefully. "It sounds like you miss her." Blake's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly not the response he'd been expecting. "Most people think I need professional help." "Maybe you do," Max replied with a slight shrug. "But that doesn't mean talking to her is wrong. Some of the most important conversations happen with people who aren't physically there anymore." For the first time since Max had arrived at the estate, Blake smiled, not the polite, distant expression he'd expected, but something genuine and surprised. "Exactly," Blake said, looking back at Victoria's portrait. "She was my business partner, my best friend, my wife. Why would I stop talking to her just because she can't answer back in ways other people can hear?" And in that moment, Max realized that his role in the Whitmore household was about to become something entirely different from what anyone had anticipated. The afternoon following Max's discovery brought an unexpected shift in the household's dynamics. Blake had retreated to his study after their brief conversation, but not before asking Max to prepare lunch for two, a request that puzzled Mrs. Whitmore's carefully laid plans about maintaining professional distance. "He wants lunch for two?" Mrs. Whitmore questioned when she returned from her charity meeting, her perfectly composed expression showing the first crack of genuine surprise. Blake hasn't shared a meal with anyone since Victoria's funeral. Max stood in the pristine kitchen, surrounded by ingredients he'd gathered for what he assumed would be a simple meal preparation. But Blake's request had been specific: make something Victoria would have liked. She always said the best conversations happened over good food. Should I not prepare it? Max asked, suddenly uncertain about the boundaries of his position. Everything about this job seemed to exist in grey areas that his previous hospitality experience hadn't prepared him for. Mrs. Whitmore studied him carefully, her sharp eyes searching for something she couldn't quite identify. Blake specifically requested that you join him? He said he wanted to continue our conversation from this morning, Max replied honestly. Something about perspectives he hasn't considered before. The older woman's expression shifted through several emotions: concern, hope, wariness, and something that might have been relief. Mr. Fisher, I need you to understand something. Blake hasn't had a substantive conversation with anyone outside of business calls for nearly 2 years. If he's reaching out to you, it means something significant. She paused beside the kitchen island, her manicured fingers drumming silently against the marble surface. But it also means you're entering territory that the previous employees found overwhelming. Blake's relationship with Victoria's memory is complex. Some people find it beautiful, others find it disturbing. Max nodded, understanding the weight of what she wasn't saying directly. What do you find it? I find it heartbreaking, Mrs. Whitmore admitted, but also the only thing that's kept him functional since the accident. Without those conversations, I think he would have disappeared entirely. An hour later, Max found himself carrying a tray of grilled salmon and roasted vegetables through the house toward Blake's study, a room he hadn't yet entered. The door was open, revealing a space that felt like a cross between a corporate office and a private library. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 2 walls, while a third featured multiple computer monitors and sophisticated audio-visual equipment. Blake sat behind a mahogany desk that looked like it could seat a board meeting, but his attention wasn't on the computers or paperwork. Instead, he was arranging 2 chairs to face a smaller portrait of Victoria that Max hadn't noticed before, a more intimate painting that showed her laughing. Caught in a moment of genuine joy, she always insisted that business discussions went better when people could actually see each other. Blake explained without looking up from his arrangements. Said you could learn more about someone's character from how they ate their food than from any resume. Max set the tray down on a side table, noting the careful way Blake had positioned everything. This wasn't casual lunch. It was a deliberate recreation of something that had obviously been important to Blake and Victoria. I should mention, Blake continued, finally meeting Max's eyes, I've never done this before. Had lunch with someone while including Victoria in the conversation, I mean. It might seem strange. There was vulnerability in Blake's admission that contrasted sharply with his obvious wealth and success. Here was someone who had built a multi-million-dollar company but was nervous about sharing a meal with an employee. Strange compared to what? Max replied, taking the seat Blake indicated. Yesterday, I was eating ramen noodles alone in a studio apartment, wondering if I'd be able to make rent. Everything about this is strange, but that doesn't make it wrong. Blake smiled, the same genuine expression Max had glimpsed the day before. Victoria would have liked that answer. She had this theory that people who were comfortable with uncertainty were usually the most trustworthy. They began eating in relative silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Blake occasionally glanced at Victoria's portrait and made small comments, observations about the food, mentions of business decisions he was considering, questions about Max's background that felt like genuine curiosity rather than polite conversation. You worked in hospitality, Blake said after a few minutes. What made you good at it? Listening, Max replied without hesitation. Most people think hospitality is about providing services, but it's really about paying attention to what people actually need versus what they think they want. Blake's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Explain that. A guest might request a late checkout because they're tired, but if you pay attention, you realize they're actually anxious about traveling alone. So you don't just approve the late checkout. You make sure they have reliable transportation arranged and maybe suggest they call someone when they reach their destination. You see the story behind the request, Blake said thoughtfully, glancing at Victoria's portrait. Vic always said that about business too. Customers don't just want products, they want solutions to problems they sometimes can't even articulate. It was the first time Blake had referenced Victoria directly in Max's presence, and the moment felt significant. Not because Blake was talking about his deceased wife, but because he was including Max in that conversation naturally. What kind of problems was your company solving? Max asked, genuinely curious. Blake's expression brightened with the first enthusiasm Max had seen from him. Educational technology. We developed software that adapted to different learning styles. Visual, auditory, kinesthetic. Victoria's idea, actually. She'd been a teacher before we got married, and she was frustrated by how many brilliant kids got labeled as slow learners just because they processed information differently. As Blake spoke about the company, his energy transformed completely. This wasn't the isolated grieving widower Mrs. Whitmore had described. This was someone passionate about work that mattered. Someone who saw business as a vehicle for positive change. We started small, Blake continued, occasionally directing comments toward Victoria's portrait. Remember that first school in Riverside, Vic? 40 kids, half of them reading below grade level. By the end of the pilot program, 37 of them had caught up or exceeded their targets. Max watched the interplay between Blake's direct conversation with him and his asides to Victoria's image. Rather than seeming disconnected from reality, it felt like Blake was sharing a story that belonged to both of them, honoring Victoria's contributions while connecting with someone new. The company's still growing, Blake continued. We're in over 300 schools now, but I've been reluctant to expand internationally. It feels like such a big step to take without, he trailed off, his gaze settling on Victoria's portrait with an expression that mixed love and loss in equal measure. Without her input, Max finished gently. Blake nodded. Every major decision we made was collaborative. I don't know how to make choices that big alone. In that moment, Max realized he was being presented with something much more complex than a job. Blake wasn't just grieving. He was stuck in a pattern of seeking guidance from someone who could no longer provide it in conventional ways. But rather than being purely destructive, these conversations seemed to be the only thing keeping Blake connected to his sense of purpose. What do you think she would say about international expansion? Max asked, surprising himself with the question. Blake looked at him sharply, as if testing whether the question was sincere. Then he turned to Victoria's portrait with the same attentive expression Max had witnessed the day before. She'd probably ask about infrastructure, Blake said after a moment. Victoria was always practical about implementation. She'd want to know if we had the support systems in place to maintain quality while scaling up. And for the first time since entering the Whitmore household, Max began to understand that his role might involve much more than simple domestic duties. 3 weeks into his employment at the Whitmore estate, Max found himself navigating territory that no job training could have prepared him for. What had begun as simple domestic work had evolved into something resembling grief counseling, business consultation, and friendship, often. Simultaneously, Blake had begun requesting Max's presence for what he called advisory sessions, meetings, where Blake would discuss complex business decisions while including Victoria's portrait in the conversation. Max's role had gradually shifted from silent observer to active participant, though he was still learning the delicate balance required to support Blake's unique communication style without overstepping invisible boundaries. The Jakarta proposal came back with modifications, Blake announced during their morning meeting in the conservatory. A glass-walled room filled with exotic plants that Victoria had apparently designed. Blake had moved her smaller portrait here, positioning it where sunlight would catch the painted highlights in her hair. Max had learned that Blake rotated Victoria's portraits through different rooms based on what type of conversation he wanted to have with her. The conservatory was for international business discussions. Victoria had been passionate about global education initiatives. They want to pilot the program in 50 schools instead of the E20 we proposed, Blake continued, speaking to the portrait. I know you'd say that's too ambitious for a first international deployment, but their enthusiasm is compelling. Blake paused, his attention fixed on Victoria's painted expression as if waiting for a response. Max had initially found these pauses awkward, but he'd learned they served a purpose. Blake was processing information and considering perspectives that Victoria might have offered. What are your concerns about the larger pilot? Max asked, a question that had become his standard approach. Rather than trying to speak for Victoria, he'd learned to ask questions that helped Blake access his own insights about what she might have thought. Scale management, Blake replied immediately. Victoria always worried about quality control when expanding too quickly. She'd seen too many educational programs fail because they prioritized reach over effectiveness. Blake turned from the portrait to look directly at Max. But here's what I can't figure out. How do I balance her caution with the opportunity to help more kids immediately? In Jakarta, there are children in overcrowded classrooms right now who could benefit from our adaptive learning software. It was questions like these that had begun keeping Max awake at night. Blake wasn't just seeking emotional comfort from his conversations with Victoria. He was trying to make real business decisions that would affect thousands of students. The responsibility felt enormous, especially since Max's background was in hospitality, not education technology or international business. Walk me through how you and Victoria used to approach decisions like this, Max suggested, settling into the chair Blake had designated as his usual spot. Blake's expression shifted, becoming more focused and analytical. We'd start with worst-case scenarios. Victoria insisted on identifying everything that could go wrong before we got excited about what could go right. So what could go wrong with a 50-school pilot in Jakarta? Implementation failures that damage our reputation internationally, Blake replied without hesitation. Staff training issues that leave teachers frustrated with technology they can't properly use. Cultural misunderstandings about learning styles that make our software irrelevant to Indonesian students. As Blake spoke, Max noticed his posture changing, becoming more confident and decisive. These weren't the words of someone lost in grief, but of a business leader working through complex problems methodically. Victoria would also want contingency plans, Blake continued, glancing at the portrait. She'd insist on building relationships with local educators who could provide ongoing feedback, not just deploying software and hoping for the best. That sounds like she was thinking about sustainability, not just immediate impact, Max observed. Exactly, Blake smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in a way that transformed his entire face. She always said that good intentions without proper execution just created more problems for the people you were trying to help. Over the following days, Max began to understand the sophisticated system Blake had developed for maintaining his connection with Victoria while continuing to function as a business leader. Different rooms, different portraits, different types of decisions, all carefully organized to access different aspects of Victoria's perspective and expertise. But he also began to see the limitations of Blake's approach. While his conversations with Victoria helped him process complex decisions, they kept him isolated from other perspectives that might be equally valuable. Blake's entire social and professional world had contracted to accommodate his grief, creating a bubble that protected him but also constrained him. Have you considered bringing in external consultants for the Jakarta project? Max asked during one of their sessions. People with specific experience in Southeast Asian education markets? Blake's reaction was immediate and defensive. Victoria and I always handled international expansion ourselves. We understood our product better than any consultant could, but Victoria's been gone for 2 years, Max said gently. The international education market has probably changed significantly since then. The temperature in the conservatory seemed to drop several degrees. Blake's expression hardened, and for a moment Max thought he had finally crossed the line that would end his employment. "Are you suggesting that my conversations with Victoria are outdated?" Blake's voice carried a warning that Max had never heard before. "I'm suggesting that Victoria was brilliant enough to adapt her thinking based on new information," Max replied carefully, "and that she might want you to seek out that new information rather than making decisions based solely on what she knew 2 years ago." Blake stared at him for a long moment, then turned to Victoria's portrait with an expression that mixed frustration and confusion. "This is why I don't like involving other people in our discussions, Vic. They don't understand how this works." But even as Blake spoke to the portrait, Max could see uncertainty in his posture. For the first time, Blake seemed to be questioning whether his approach was sufficient for the challenges he was facing. "Maybe the question isn't whether to involve other people," Max suggested. "Maybe it's about how Victoria would want you to involve them. She was a teacher. She understood the value of different perspectives and collaborative learning." Blake was quiet for several minutes, his gaze moving between Victoria's portrait and the garden visible through the conservatory's glass walls. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, more vulnerable than Max had heard it before. "The hardest part about losing someone isn't just missing them," Blake said. "It's making decisions that they'll never see the results of. Victoria will never know whether the Jakarta project succeeds or fails. She'll never see the students who benefit from our work or learn from the mistakes we make." For the first time since meeting Blake, Max heard the full weight of his grief, not just sadness about Victoria's absence, but anguish about moving forward without her witness, her approval, her partnership in shaping their shared legacy. "But maybe that's exactly why these decisions matter so much," Max replied. "Because they're your way of honoring what she cared about, even when she can't be there to see the results." Blake looked at him with surprise, as if hearing something he hadn't considered before. And in that moment, Max realized that their relationship was evolving beyond employee and employer, beyond even friendship, into something that might actually help both of them grow in ways neither had anticipated. The crisis began with a phone call that shattered the careful equilibrium Blake had built around his grief. Dr. Amanda Chen, the lead researcher from their Jakarta partner organization, was calling with news that would force Blake to confront the limitations of his isolated decision-making process. "Mr. Whitmore," Dr. Chen's voice carried urgency through the speakerphone in Blake's study. "We've discovered significant issues with our pilot program assumptions. The learning style assessments we based our software on don't translate effectively to Indonesian educational culture." Blake sat frozen behind his desk, staring at Victoria's portrait as if it might provide immediate answers to problems that hadn't existed when she was alive. Max watched from his usual chair, seeing Blake's confidence crumble in real time. "What kind of issues?" Blake managed to ask. "Our individual, focused, adaptive learning conflicts with Indonesian collaborative learning traditions. Students there learn through group discussion and collective problem-solving, not personalized digital experiences. We need to completely redesign our approach." After Dr. Chen ended the call with promises to send detailed reports, Blake remained motionless for nearly 10 minutes. When he finally spoke, it was to Victoria's portrait. But his voice carried a desperation Max had never heard before. "We never encountered anything like this. Vic, all our previous international work was in countries with educational systems similar to the United States. How am I supposed to solve problems you never had to face?" For the first time since Max had known him, Blake seemed to be questioning whether his conversations with Victoria could provide the guidance he needed. The realization was clearly terrifying him. Maybe this is exactly the kind of challenge that requires new approaches, Max suggested carefully. Blake's head snapped toward him with an expression that mixed anger and panic. "New approaches? Everything successful about our company came from Victoria's insights. Without her perspective, I'm just another tech entrepreneur throwing money at problems I don't understand. Over the next several days, Blake's behavior shifted dramatically. Instead of his usual thoughtful conversations with Victoria's portraits, he began frantically moving between rooms, seeking different versions of her image, as if one might hold answers, the others didn't. He stopped eating regular meals, instead requesting coffee and energy bars that he consumed while pacing between his study, the conservatory, and the main living room. "He's not sleeping," Mrs. Whitmore confided to Max during one of their brief encounters in the kitchen. "I can hear him moving around the house all night, talking to Victoria's portraits in different rooms. This is the worst I've seen him since immediately after the funeral." Max found himself in an impossible position. His job was to support Blake, but watching someone he'd grown to care about spiral into anxiety and self-doubt was becoming unbearable. When Blake began requesting that meals be left outside his door again, returning to the isolation patterns he'd abandoned weeks earlier, Max knew something had to change. The Jakarta team is flying in next week for emergency consultations, Blake announced during what would be their last shared meal for several days. Dr. Chen wants to meet in person to discuss complete program restructuring. Blake's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and he kept glancing between multiple portraits of Victoria that he'd arranged around the dining room, the formal portrait from the living room, the intimate, laughing image from his study, and a professional headshot that showed her in teaching mode. "Maybe having Dr. Chen here will help," Max suggested. "She understands Indonesian educational culture in ways that Victoria never could," Blake interrupted bitterly. "Yes, I'm beginning to understand that. I'm also beginning to understand that I've built my entire business strategy around the advice of someone who's been dead for 2 years. The pain in Blake's voice was raw and immediate. For the first time, he was acknowledging the fundamental problem with his coping mechanism, not that talking to Victoria was wrong, but that it had become his only source of guidance for problems that required living expertise. "That's not what I meant," Max said gently. "Isn't it?" Blake's laugh was hollow. "You've been diplomatically pointing out the limitations of my approach for weeks. Well, congratulations, you were right. I can't run an international company by having imaginary conversations with my dead wife." Blake stood abruptly, leaving his untouched dinner on the table. "Dr. Chen arrives Monday. I'll handle the meetings myself. You can go back to regular household duties." With that dismissal, Blake retreated to his study and didn't emerge for the rest of the evening. But rather than the peaceful silence that usually indicated Blake was having productive conversations with Victoria, the sounds coming from the East Wing suggested someone in distress, pacing footsteps, muffled conversations that seemed to go in circles, and at one point, what sounded like frustrated shouting. By Sunday evening, Mrs. Whitmore was ready to call Blake's therapist despite his repeated refusals to return to counseling. "He's destroying himself," she told Max, "and I don't know how to help him." Max spent that night lying awake in his small apartment above the estate's garage, listening to Blake's restless movement through the main house and thinking about the impossible situation they all faced. Blake's conversations with Victoria had kept him functional and connected to his sense of purpose. But they had also isolated him from the living relationships and current information. He needed to grow both personally and professionally. The next morning brought Dr. Chen's arrival and the most challenging day since Max had started working for the Whitmores. Blake appeared for the meeting impeccably dressed, but clearly exhausted, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something that looked like barely controlled desperation. "Dr. Chen, thank you for making the trip," Blake said, his voice professionally polite but lacking any warmth. "I understand we have significant problems to solve." Dr. Chen, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a manner that suggested both intelligence and patience, studied Blake carefully before responding. "Mr. Whitmore, I've been looking forward to meeting you in person. Your wife's educational philosophy influenced our entire approach to this partnership. At the mention of Victoria, Blake's composure cracked visibly. "My wife has been dead for 2 years, Dr. Chen. Her educational philosophy may not be relevant to current challenges." The meeting continued for 3 painful hours, with Blake alternating between defensive responses to Dr. Chen's suggestions and desperate attempts to apply Victoria's thinking to problems she'd never encountered. Dr. Chen remained patient and professional, but Max could see her growing concern about Blake's state of mind. "Perhaps we should continue these discussions tomorrow," Dr. Chen finally suggested. "I know this represents a significant shift in approach, and major changes require careful consideration." After Dr. Chen left for her hotel, Blake collapsed into the chair in his study, staring at Victoria's portrait with an expression of complete defeat. "I don't know how to do this without you," he whispered to the painting. "I don't know how to make decisions that affect thousands of children when I can't even figure out how to have a normal conversation with a colleague." For the first time since Max had known him, Blake's conversations with Victoria sounded like pleas, rather than consultations, the desperate requests of someone who had finally acknowledged that his primary coping mechanism was no longer sufficient for the challenges he faced. The breaking point came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night when Max was awakened by the sound of shattering glass echoing through the estate. He threw on clothes and rushed toward the main house, his heart pounding as he imagined the worst possible scenarios. What he found in the conservatory was devastating. In a way he hadn't anticipated, Blake sat on the floor. Among the scattered remains of Victoria's portrait, the intimate painting that had been his companion for international business discussions. Fragments of glass from the frame sparkled around him like dangerous confetti, and his hands were bleeding from apparently trying to gather the pieces together. "I couldn't hear her anymore," Blake said without looking up when Max entered. His voice was hollow, drained of all the passion and intelligence that had characterized their previous conversations. "I kept asking her about Dr. Chen's recommendations, about the cultural adaptation issues, about how to rebuild our entire approach to international education. But there was nothing, just silence." Max carefully navigated through the broken glass to reach Blake, noting that the conservatory's exotic plants seemed to loom over them like witnesses to this private breakdown. "Blake, you're bleeding. Let me help you with your hands." "It doesn't matter," Blake replied, still staring at the destroyed portrait. "Don't you see? It was never real. Victoria wasn't giving me guidance. I was just projecting my own thoughts onto her memory. And when I encountered problems she'd never faced, the projection fell apart. The admission hung in the air between them like a physical presence." After months of Max carefully supporting Blake's conversations with Victoria, Blake himself had finally acknowledged what everyone around him had been too afraid to say directly. "The Jakarta project is finished," Blake continued, his voice flat and factual. "Dr. Chen called an hour ago to inform me that our partner organization is withdrawing from the collaboration. They've decided to work with a company that has actual expertise in cross-cultural educational adaptation, not one run by someone who makes business decisions by talking to paintings." Max felt the ground shift beneath him. Dr. Chen had seemed patient and understanding during her visit. "What exactly did she say?" Blake finally looked up, and Max was shocked by the emptiness in his eyes. "She said that after observing my decision-making process, she had concerns about my ability to adapt to changing circumstances. She was diplomatic about it, but the message was clear. I'm unstable, unprofessional, and unsuited for international business." "Blake, that's one project, one setback. It doesn't define one project." Blake's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Max, the Jakarta initiative was supposed to be our entry point into Southeast Asian markets. We've been planning it for 3 years, ever since Victoria first suggested expanding into regions with underserved educational systems. Losing it doesn't just mean losing revenue. It means losing the chance to help millions of children who need exactly what our software could provide." Blake struggled to his feet, ignoring Max's offer of assistance. And the worst part is that Victoria would have seen this coming. She would have insisted on cultural consultation from the beginning. She would have built relationships with local educators before assuming our American design software could work anywhere. But I was so focused on maintaining my connection with her memory that I forgot to actually learn from her example. The next few days brought a cascade of disasters that seemed designed to test every aspect of Blake's life simultaneously. News of the Jakarta project's failure leaked to tech industry publications, triggering speculation about Blake's mental health and his company's stability. 3 major clients requested meetings to reassess their partnerships, which everyone understood meant they were preparing to leave. The company's stock price dropped 12% in 2 days. Mrs. Whitmore tried desperately to manage the crisis, fielding calls from board members and attempting damage control with the media. But Blake had retreated so completely that he wasn't available for the leadership the situation demanded. "He won't leave his room," she told Max during a brief encounter in the hallway. "He's not answering calls from his business partners, his attorney, or even his therapist. I'm afraid he's going to lose everything Victoria and he built together." Max found himself in the impossible position of watching someone he cared about self-destruct while being powerless to help. Blake had dismissed him from their advisory sessions, returning to the complete isolation that had characterized his first year of grief. But unlike that earlier isolation, this withdrawal carried a quality of finality that was terrifying. When Max tried to deliver meals to Blake's room, he found them untouched hours later. When he knocked to check on Blake's well-being, there was no response. The entire east wing of the house had become a tomb of silence that felt dangerous. On Thursday evening, Max discovered Blake in the main living room, sitting in front of Victoria's formal portrait with a laptop computer, frantically typing what appeared to be resignation letters. "I'm dissolving the company," Blake announced, without looking away from his screen. "Better to shut down deliberately than to let it collapse while dragging our employees and clients down with us." "Blake, you can't make decisions like that when you're in crisis," Max said, approaching carefully. "These aren't problems that require shutting down. They require adaptation." "Adaptation," Blake repeated mockingly. "The thing I've proven I'm incapable of. The thing Victoria could do effortlessly, but that I, apparently, can't learn even with 2 years of your practice." Blake's fingers moved across the keyboard with manic energy as he continued drafting what would essentially be the death certificate for everything he and Victoria had created together. "I'm liquidating all assets and putting the proceeds into an educational foundation in Victoria's name. At least that way, some good might come from the wreckage of my incompetence." "You're not incompetent," Max said firmly. "You're grieving, and you've been trying to process that grief while running a complex business. Anyone would struggle with that combination. Anyone else would have sought help," Blake replied. "Anyone else would have brought in partners, consultants, advisors, living people with current expertise. Instead, I convinced myself that love and memory were sufficient substitutes for actual knowledge." Blake saved his document and closed the laptop with finality. Dr. Chen was right to withdraw. "I'm not stable enough for international business. I'm probably not stable enough for any business." He stood and walked toward the staircase leading to his private quarters. "I'll be out of the house by the weekend. You and Mom can figure out what to do with Victoria's portraits. I can't bear to look at them anymore." As Blake disappeared upstairs, Max realized they had reached the absolute bottom. Blake wasn't just giving up on his business or his unconventional coping mechanisms. He was preparing to abandon everything that connected him to Victoria and to his own sense of purpose. The crisis had revealed the fundamental flaw in Blake's approach. His conversations with Victoria had become a substitute for growth rather than a catalyst for it. Instead of honoring her memory by continuing to learn and adapt as she would have, he had tried to freeze her insights in time, creating a beautiful but ultimately limiting shrine to their shared past. And now, faced with the failure of that approach, Blake was choosing destruction over transformation. ending everything rather than risking the pain of building something new. Max spent Friday night walking the estate's grounds, wrestling with a decision that could cost him his job, but might save Blake's life. The moonlight cast long shadows across the manicured gardens as he formulated a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane, possibly both. At dawn on Saturday, instead of following Blake's instructions to leave him alone, Max knocked firmly on the door of Blake's private suite. When there was no response, he used the master key Mrs. Whitmore had given him for emergencies and entered anyway. Blake sat on his bed, still wearing the same clothes from 2 days earlier, staring blankly at packed suitcases. Legal documents were scattered across his nightstand, signed papers that would dissolve the company and transfer all assets to the Victoria Whitmore Educational Foundation. I told you I wanted to be left alone, Blake said without looking up. I know, Max replied, settling into the chair by Blake's window. But I've been thinking about something you said the other night, about how you couldn't hear Victoria anymore when you really needed her guidance. Blake's jaw tightened. I don't want to discuss my psychological breakdown with the household staff. What if it wasn't a breakdown? Max continued, ignoring Blake's dismissive tone. What if the silence you experienced was actually Victoria responding in the most honest way possible? That got Blake's attention. He turned to look at Max with a mixture of confusion and irritation. What are you talking about? You said Victoria was a teacher. Teachers don't give students answers to questions they haven't learned enough to understand yet. They create situations where students have to discover the answers themselves. Max leaned forward, his voice gaining confidence as his theory crystallized. Maybe Victoria's silence wasn't abandonment. Maybe it was her way of telling you that this particular lesson requires you to find living teachers. Blake stared at him for a long moment. That's either profound or completely ridiculous. Dr. Chen is still in Los Angeles, Max said. Her flight back to Jakarta isn't until Monday morning. What if instead of giving up on the partnership, you approached her not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone willing to learn from her expertise? She already thinks I'm unstable, Blake replied. Why would she want to work with someone who makes business decisions by consulting portraits? Because maybe you explained to her that those conversations weren't about getting supernatural guidance, Max suggested. Maybe you explained that they were your way of accessing the collaborative, decision-making style you developed with Victoria, and that you're ready to develop that same collaborative approach with living partners. Blake was quiet for several minutes, his gaze moving between his packed suitcases and the window overlooking the garden, where he and Victoria had apparently spent many mornings planning their company's future. Even if Dr. Chen agreed to meet again, it's too late, Blake finally said. The damage to the company's reputation, the client defections, the board's loss of confidence, it's irreversible. Is it? Max challenged. Or is this exactly the kind of crisis that forces companies to evolve into something better than they were before? What happened next surprised both of them. Instead of responding to Max directly, Blake stood and walked to Victoria's formal portrait, which he had moved to his bedroom during his retreat. But instead of the desperate, one-sided conversations Max had witnessed recently, Blake spoke to the painting with a clarity and strength that had been missing for days. You always said that the best learning happens when people are forced outside their comfort zones, Blake said to Victoria's painted image. You'd probably say that this crisis is exactly what I need to stop relying on our past successes and start building new, collaborative relationships. Blake paused, but not with the expectant waiting that had characterized his earlier conversations. This pause felt different, reflective rather than desperate. And you'd probably remind me that teachers don't abandon students when lessons get difficult, Blake continued. They find new ways to help students understand what they need to learn. Blake turned back to Max with an expression that was still tired but no longer defeated. Dr. Chen mentioned during our meeting that she'd studied our company's early development. She said Victoria's educational philosophy was brilliant, but that it needed Updating for current global contexts. That sounds like someone who respects what you and Victoria built but recognizes that it needs to grow. Max observed, what if Blake began, then stopped himself. What if I called Dr. Chen and proposed something completely different? What if, instead of trying to adapt our existing software for Indonesia, we collaborated on developing entirely new approaches to cross-cultural educational technology? Max felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, hope replacing despair, possibility replacing resignation. What would that look like? Blake's energy was transforming before Max's eyes, the passionate business leader emerging from the cocoon of grief and isolation. It would mean acknowledging that Victoria and I created something valuable but incomplete. It would mean partnering with educators like Dr. Chen, who understand contexts we never experienced. Blake moved to his laptop and began pulling up files with the focused intensity Max had seen in their early conversations. We'd essentially be creating a new company division, cross-cultural educational development. Dr. Chen would be a full partner, not a consultant. Indonesian educators would be collaborators, not test subjects. And your conversations with Victoria? Max asked carefully. Blake looked at Victoria's portrait with an expression that was loving but no longer desperate. They become what they probably should have been all along, a way to honor her insights while building on them with new knowledge from living partners. Blake was already reaching for his phone. Dr. Chen probably thinks I'm crazy, but maybe crazy is exactly what this project needs. Traditional approaches to international educational technology have been failing for years. Maybe it's time for something genuinely innovative. As Blake dialed Dr. Chen's number, Max realized he was witnessing something remarkable, not the abandonment of Blake's connection to Victoria, but its evolution into something more sustainable and growth-oriented. Instead of trying to preserve their relationship exactly as it had been, Blake was finally ready to let it become what Victoria would have wanted, a foundation for continued learning and collaboration. Dr. Chen. This is Blake Whitmore, Blake said when she answered. I know you're probably surprised to hear from me, but I have a proposal that might interest you. What if we started over completely? Not trying to fix our failed approach, but creating something entirely new together. Max listened as Blake outlined his vision for true collaborative development, speaking with the confidence and enthusiasm that had been missing from his voice for months. This wasn't the Blake who desperately sought answers from portraits, nor was it the Blake who had given up entirely on his company's mission. This was someone who had finally learned to honor the past while embracing the uncertainty and possibility of the future. Exactly what Victoria would have wanted him to discover. 6 months later, the Whitmore estate buzzed with an energy that would have been unimaginable during Blake's darkest period. The East Wing, once a shrine to isolation, had been converted into a collaborative workspace where Blake, Dr. Chen, and a rotating team of international educators worked together via video conferences and in-person visits to develop what had become the most innovative cross-cultural educational technology project in the industry. Max found Blake in the conservatory on a bright Tuesday morning, but the scene was completely transformed from their early tentative conversations. Blake sat at a conference table with Dr. Chen, who had relocated to Los Angeles as co-director of their new global education initiative, and Maria Santos, a remarkable educator from São Paulo, who had joined their partnership after hearing about their collaborative approach. The preliminary results from the pilot programs in Indonesia, Brazil and Kenya are beyond what we hoped for, Dr. Chen was saying, her enthusiasm evident even through her professional demeanor. Student engagement is up 43% across all 3 regions, and teacher satisfaction ratings are the highest we've ever recorded. Blake smiled as he reviewed the data on his tablet. But what struck Max most was how naturally Blake included Victoria in the celebration. Her portrait, the formal painting from the living room, had been moved to the conservatory, but it no longer dominated the space. Instead, it sat among photographs of their international partners. student artwork from their pilot programs, and whiteboards covered with collaborative planning notes. Victoria would have loved seeing these results, and Blake said, glancing at her portrait with affection rather than desperation, especially the feedback from the Kenyan teachers about how our software helped them adapt lessons for students with different learning challenges. She sounds like she would have been fascinated by our next phase, Maria added, pulling up designs for their upcoming expansion into Latin American markets. This approach of building technology around existing cultural learning patterns instead of trying to impose external systems, it's revolutionary. Max watched this interaction with wonder. Blake's relationship with Victoria's memory had evolved into something healthy and sustainable, a source of inspiration and continuity rather than a substitute for living relationships. He still spoke to her portrait, but now those conversations happened within the context of ongoing collaboration with living partners who brought their own expertise and perspectives. "Max," Blake called, noticing him in the doorway. "Perfect timing. We're planning the formal launch of our global education initiative for next month. Would you mind coordinating with Mom about hosting the celebration here at the estate?" This was another transformation that amazed Max daily. Blake had gone from someone who couldn't bear to have guests in his home to someone who actively wanted to share his space and his success with the wider community. The estate had become a place of connection rather than isolation. "Mrs. Whitmore is already planning the menu," Max replied with a smile. "She's as excited about this launch as you are." "She should be," Dr. Chen interjected. "This project is going to impact educational opportunities for over 50,000 students in its first year alone. That's the kind of legacy that changes generations." After the meeting concluded and their international partners signed off their video conferences, Blake and Max found themselves alone in the conservatory, a setting that had witnessed both Blake's greatest struggles and his most significant breakthroughs. "I wanted to thank you," Blake said, settling into the chair that had become Max's usual spot during their early conversations. "Not just for staying when I tried to push you away, but for helping me understand what Victoria's silence was really telling me." Max studied Blake's face, noting the peace that had replaced the desperate energy of their first months together. "What do you think it was telling you?" "That love doesn't mean preserving someone exactly as they were," Blake replied thoughtfully. "It means continuing to grow in ways that would make them proud." Victoria wasn't trying to give me all the answers from beyond the grave. She was trusting me to find living teachers who could help me become the person our shared vision required. Blake looked at Victoria's portrait with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had found a healthy way to maintain connection with a beloved partner. "I still talk to her, but now it's more like reporting back on adventures she started but couldn't finish herself. Sharing discoveries with someone who planted the seeds but trusted others to help them grow." "And what do you think she'd say about everything that's happened?" Max asked. Blake's smile was immediate and genuine. "She'd probably tease me about how long it took me to figure out that grief doesn't have to mean stopping growth. And then she'd want to hear every detail about our partnership with Dr. Chen and Maria, because collaborative learning was always what excited her most." The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Whitmore, entering the conservatory with afternoon tea, a daily ritual she had instituted as the household had returned to more normal rhythms. "The interview requests are piling up," she announced with obvious pride. "Harvard Business Review wants to feature your collaboration model, and the International Education Association wants Blake to keynote their annual conference. The keynote invitation specifically mentioned that they want you to talk about innovative approaches to grief and leadership," Mrs. Whitmore continued. "Apparently, word has spread about how you transformed personal loss into professional breakthrough." Blake considered this for a moment, then looked at Victoria's portrait with the consulting expression that had become his signature approach to major decisions. "What do you think, Vic? Ready to have our story help other people who are trying to figure out how to honor the past while building the future?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and then Blake nodded as if he had received the answer he was looking for. "Tell them yes," Blake said to his mother, "but I want to be clear that this isn't just my story. It's about what becomes possible when people understand that healing doesn't mean forgetting, and growth doesn't mean abandonment," as the afternoon light filtered through the conservatory's glass walls, illuminating the plants that Victoria had chosen and the collaborative workspace that Blake had created. Max reflected on the journey they had all taken together. What had begun as a desperate job search had become a masterclass in transformation, not just for Blake, but for everyone who had witnessed his evolution from isolated grief to inspired leadership. The estate that had once felt like a beautiful tomb had become a launching pad for innovations that would impact educational opportunities around the world. Blake had discovered that the most powerful way to honor Victoria's memory was not to preserve their relationship in amber, but to let it grow into something that could continue creating positive change long after both of them were gone. And Max had learned that sometimes the most profound service you can provide for someone isn't giving them answers, but helping them discover the questions that lead to their own breakthrough. In the end, the new Maid had indeed shocked everyone with his response to finding the millionaire's son talking to his deceased mother's portrait. But the shock wasn't what anyone had expected. Instead of judgment or concern, Max had offered understanding that transformed not just Blake's approach to grief, but his entire understanding of how love can become a force for continued growth and positive impact in the world. The portrait still hung in the conservatory, but it was no longer a shrine to the past. It had become a window into a future where love transcends loss, where collaboration conquers isolation, and where the most beautiful conversations are the ones that inspire us to keep growing long after they end. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.